Hello and welcome to this overview of the AQA GCSE History content, covering Part 3 of the America, Opportunity and Inequality course, including the post-war society and economy, racial tensions and civil rights campaigns, and the Great Society. We are going to be covering the content quite quickly, so if there is anything that you are unsure about, make sure to pause the video, take a note, and go back over it later. If you have not seen Part 1 or 2 of this course, have a look on my channel so that you can complete your learning. To begin with, we are going to look at the post-war society and economy, as World War II had huge effects on America, as we will shortly see. As life began to return to normal after the war, so did manufacturing and people's desires to buy new goods. Technologies like fridges, ovens, and cars were produced quickly and affordably, allowing them to be accessible to millions. There were 75 million cars on American roads by 1956. War-torn Europe was also keen to buy American goods, with 65% of the world's manufactured goods supplied by America by 1952. The country also saw a baby boom after the war, causing a rapidly growing population. The government also helped during this time, with the GI Bill designed to help ex-soldiers. $4 billion worth of loans and grants were given out, often paying for houses or college. President Roosevelt had died in 1945, and his vice president, Truman, took over, with similar aspirations of helping the Americans that were most in need. His plans, called the Fair Deal, aimed to tackle two issues: poverty and the rights of African Americans. He raised the minimum wage, made room for affordable housing and tried to create a national health insurance scheme, although this was blocked by the Republicans. His attempt to improve the rights of African Americans also failed because of the Southern politicians voting against it. Truman was replaced in 1952 by Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican war hero who placed many businessmen in government to aid the economy. As a result, wages rose, and so did living conditions for millions throughout the country. We are now going to talk about the American dream, a term which describes the idea that anyone could succeed in America with hard work. Despite many feeling like they were living the dream during the 1950s, 25% of people were still living in poverty, many of those in the South, with unsafe housing and poor schools. Many elderly people struggled during this time too, without enough money to get by often. Despite many women getting valuable, manual jobs during the war, which you can learn more about in the previous video, millions returned to stereotypical women's roles, many becoming housewives, or facing discrimination if they did try to pursue a career. Some, however, were becoming frustrated with these limitations, with change on the horizon. Next up is the fear of communism. Straight after the war, a second Red Scare had started, with many people afraid of the powerful Soviet Union, an enemy to America during the Cold War. Many feared that communism would spread through America like it had done in many European countries, which allowed for the rise of politicians like McCarthy, who we will talk about shortly. The policy of containment tried to stop this spread, although other countries, like China, turned communist during this time, and stories of communists in governments made headlines, installing fear throughout society. A group called HWAC, House of Representatives Un-American Activities Committee, searched for communists, while Truman's loyalty program searched the government for any security risks, with many losing their jobs or even spending time in jail under these accusations. McCarthyism was popular in the 1950s, named after the politician Joseph McCarthy, who used the fear of communism among society to gather popularity, launching a wild campaign that searched for communists in society. He accused many different people, often innocent, including Charlie Chaplin, until he eventually lost support because he could not justify his accusations. We are now going to talk about popular culture during the 1950s, and start by focusing on the rock and roll generation. After the war, the birth of the teenager was witnessed, with young people no longer forced into work to provide for their families, often without even finishing school. The teenagers of the 1950s were often granted a larger freedom from their parents, who wanted them to have a better life than they did, with lots of spending money and free time. Many companies took advantage of this, often directing their advertising at teenagers. A generation gap developed between their parents and the teenagers, with young people gaining a reputation for being independent, rebellious people who dressed, spoke, and behaved differently from their parents. Films and music often captured and glorified this idea, with rock and roll, a mix between different music styles, establishing itself. The strong rhythm and often sexual or rebellious lyrics made it very unpopular with the older generations, while musicians like Elvis Presley became very famous. This is known as the birth of rock and roll. Moving on to the next section, we are now going to talk about civil rights in America during this time, and to do so, we must understand the segregation laws that were in place beforehand. From the 1930s, the rights of African Americans had begun to improve in some ways, with a trade union for African Americans set up in 1937, and a law in 1941 that stated that there should be no discrimination in employment, among other things. Despite this, many African Americans still found themselves as second-class citizens, often segregated, discriminated against or subject to the Jim Crow laws. You can find out more about these in my earlier videos. The civil rights movement developed from the 1940s to the 1960s, and there are a few key events that are important to understand during this period. The first, in 1954, was the Brown versus Board of Education case, which started with a father who was unhappy that his black daughter, named Linda Brown, had to walk further to her school, an all-black school, than the local white school that was closer. He took the Board of Education to court with the help of the NAACP, but lost the case. He proceeded to take it further, to the Supreme Court, the highest court in America, who decided that every school must end segregation. Many states, however, ignored this ruling and maintained segregated schools. In 1957, 3 years after the Brown versus Board of Education case, a group of 9 African American students from Little Rock tried to attend a white children's school who were stopped by soldiers sent by the governor of the state. These students took the governor to court and won, forcing the soldiers to leave, although many schools still stayed with very few African American students in. Peaceful protests also played a part in the civil rights movement during this time, like when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus for a white man in 1955. She was arrested for this refusal to move out of the white-only section, but this sparked a large protests known as the Montgomery bus boycott, as Rosa Parks was the secretary of the NAACP. This meant that 75% of the bus company's business was no longer using them, because of the boycott led by Martin Luther King. King believed that nonviolent protests were the best way to create change, calling this idea direct action, despite the threats, violence and danger they faced. This boycott gained popularity around the world, and after almost a year, the High Court made segregated buses illegal, a big win for the civil rights movements. Martin Luther King, a Christian minister from Atlanta, became famous for his peaceful actions, leading also his March on Washington. When he, and 30,000 others, marched through Birmingham in Alabama, Police Chief Eugene Bull Connor attacked the protesters with dogs, tear gas, batons, and electric cattle prods. This was televised, and as a result, the president sent in soldiers to end segregation in the city. In 1963, King gave his famous, "I Have a Dream" speech to more than 200,000 people in the center of Washington, D.C., raising even more attention and popularity. He was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, before being assassinated in 1968. This sparked riots all over the country, while President Johnson issued a national day of mourning, and he remains the only African American to have a national holiday dedicated to him in the U.S. The Civil Rights Act, also known as the Fair Housing Act, was passed the same year, banning discrimination in housing and making it a serious crime to injure, threaten or intimidate anyone because of race or religion. Jumping back a little to 1957, Eisenhower, the president at the time, passed a Civil Rights Act, removing restrictions from voting, making discrimination illegal, and creating the Civil Rights Commission to stand up for this act, although little was actually done in practice. Other peaceful protests took place during this time, like freedom rides. These consisted of civil rights campaigners traveling around together on still segregated buses, refusing to move, mainly in southern states. Sit-ins were another way to protest, with campaigners sitting in white-only sections of cafes and restaurants, refusing to move. Just 18 months after they started in 1960, 70,000 people had participated in these protests, although they often faced more violence as they did so. President at the time, John F. Kennedy, was a strong supporter of the civil rights movements, but was assassinated in 1963 while on a re-election tour of the southern states. Lyndon Johnson took over and implemented the Civil Rights Act in 1964 as a memorial to Kennedy, making discrimination in employment and segregation illegal. However, this peaceful approach was not adopted by all, many wanting a faster solution to their problems. This takes us on to the Black Power movement, famous for the raised fist salute that made headlines at the 1968 Olympics. The Black Power movement was driven by a desire for quicker change, as many African Americans still faced poverty, as well as poor housing, wages, and education, sparking violent riots in major cities. Certain groups rejected the work of Martin Luther King, using more aggressive means to get what they wanted. The Nation of Islam was one of these groups, wanting races to be separate, known as separatism, because white society was racist, and urged African Americans to follow Islam instead of Christianity, which they claimed to be a white man's religion. Malcolm X was a well-known member of this group. There were other groups too, like the Black Panther Party, an extreme militant group with 5,000 members, who used violence to protect themselves. Malcolm X, previously mentioned, had grown up being threatened by the KKK, before being sent to prison for drug dealing and burglary. This is where he converted to Islam, and joined the Nation of Islam. He became leader of a mosque in New York, using his powerful speaking skills to convince many African Americans that violence was what they needed. He became less extreme as he got older, leaving the Nation of Islam in 1964, before being murdered by members of the group in 1965. We are now going to move on to the third section of the video, which focuses on the Great Society. Before we learn about the Great Society, we must consider the policies of Kennedy, president before Johnson, known as the New Frontier. The first part of this policy that we will talk about is how Kennedy dealt with poverty. Through the 1950s and 60s, unemployment had risen significantly, and so he created new jobs by giving money to companies to buy new equipment and people to run it. He also increased the minimum wage, increased Social Security to benefit the vulnerable, and passed a Housing Act to help deprived people. However, many still remained without a job, and Congress denied his ideas of Medicare, which was intended to provide health insurance to many. Another one of his policies involved cutting taxes and increased spending on the armed forces, creating more jobs. However, unemployment remained high, especially among African Americans, and the government had spent a lot of money creating jobs. JFK also tried to provide funding for schools, which was denied by Congress, but he did set up the Peace Corps, a successful organization that sent volunteers of many different roles to assist poor countries. He was assassinated in 1963, as previously mentioned, cutting the New Frontier short, and was replaced by Lyndon B. Johnson, his vice president. LBJ won the election in 1964 under his promise of the Great Society, in which hoped to end poverty and racial injustice. He had a different approach to Kennedy, using his intimidating nature to get what he wanted, often using the weaknesses of his political opponents against them. As I mentioned earlier, the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, banning discrimination and segregation, but Johnson also created the Voting Rights Act, which banned literacy tests and other barriers that stopped African Americans voting. This effectively removed the last of the Jim Crow laws. The Great Society program had a variety of measures, including Operation Head Start, giving money to schools, increasing the minimum wage, finally creating Medicare, which provided health care to the vulnerable, creating the Immigration Act to end restrictions for immigrants, clearing up slums, and much more. There were of course many benefits to this program, but many thought he had spent way too much on it, and by 1968, unemployment was rising again. He had also supported the Vietnam War, which made him unpopular with many. Our last focus point of the course is the feminist movement. During World War II, many women had got jobs and found a sense of independence, which they weren't willing to give up when many men returned from war, and by 1960, women made up almost half of the workforce. Kennedy set up the Status Commission in 1963, finding that women earned 60% less than men for the same job. Women were very underrepresented in some professions, and some women were even fired legally if they got married. At the same time, Betty Friedan had written a very popular book which said that women should have equal rights to men. Many women felt inspired by the civil rights movement, and so pressed for change. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 banned discrimination in employment on the basis of gender, but many women still faced significant discrimination and lower wages. The National Organization for Women was set up in 1966, which demanded equal rights, and many similar groups soon sprung up, establishing the feminist movement. This organization quickly gained popularity, although younger, more extreme women, known as the Women's Liberation Movement, used different approaches to get their point across. However, not all women supported this move to greater equality between the sexes. Phyllis Schlafly was one of these women, who opposed the 1972 Equal Rights Amendment, which said that equality should not be denied because of sex. Phyllis claimed that it would lead to women at war, higher abortion rates, and homosexual marriages, and was successful in her campaign. The amendment failed, as not enough states voted for it. Discrimination and inequality remained rife at this time. Many feminists felt that one of the most important aspects of their campaign was the ability to control their own body, and so they wanted abortions to be legalized. The Roe v. Wade case, Jane Roe successfully campaigned for the ability to have an abortion, and in 1973, the Supreme Court allowed abortions across the country, despite the laws of individual states. The feminist movement had huge impact on America, with many women gaining a voice in society and politics, despite the setbacks that they faced. And that's the end of part 3 of the course. Have a look on the Revision Realm channel for the other 2 parts to complete your learning. If you found this helpful, send it to your fellow students so that they can benefit too. If there is anything that you think I could improve, add, or change, let me know. Thanks for watching.